A medieval benefice was, at its heart, a job with benefits, but it wasn't a job in the way we think of one today. There was no salary, no hourly wage, no direct deposit every 2 weeks. Instead, a benefice was a grant of land or a source of income given to a person in exchange for performing a specific duty. Most of the time, that person was a cleric, a priest, or a bishop, and the duty was to take care of the spiritual needs of a community. The word itself comes from the Latin beneficium, which means favor or kindness. And in the beginning, that's what it was. A powerful person, like a king or a great lord, would do a favor for a loyal follower by granting them the use of a piece of land. The follower didn't own the land, they just had the right to live on it and use its produce to support themselves. In return, they owed the Lord service, usually military service. The church, which was the largest landowner in Europe, saw this system and thought it was a good idea. The church had a huge organization to run. It had thousands of parishes, cathedrals, monasteries, and chapels. All the people who worked in them, from the local village priest to the archbishop in the city, needed to be supported. They needed food, a place to live, and money to maintain their churches. So the church adapted the secular idea of the benefice. A bishop, an abbot, or even the pope would grant a priest a benefice. This was typically a parish. The grant gave the priest the right to the income from that parish. This income came from several sources. There was the glebe, which was land set aside specifically for the priest. He could farm it himself or, more likely, rent it out to local peasants. Then there were the tithes. This was a tax, usually 1/10 of everything produced by the people in the parish. 1/10 of their grain, 1/10 of their livestock, 1/10 of their wool. This was a legal obligation, not a voluntary donation. Finally, there were fees for services. People paid the priest for baptisms, marriages, and funerals. In exchange for this income, the priest had the cure of souls for that parish. This meant he was responsible for the spiritual well-being of everyone living there. He had to say Mass on Sundays and holy days. He had to hear confessions, he had to baptize the newborn, marry the young, and bury the dead. He was expected to live in the parish, in a house provided for him, usually called the rectory or the parsonage. This system defined the structure of the medieval church. The holder of the benefice was called the incumbent. The person or institution who had the right to grant the benefice was the patron. The benefice itself was considered a piece of property, a form of legal right. It was a freehold, meaning the incumbent held it for life, unless he committed a serious crime, fell into heresy, or resigned. You couldn't just fire a priest. He held his position and his income securely. This separation between the office and the payment is key. A modern CEO gets a salary, but they don't get to control the company's entire revenue stream personally. The incumbent of a benefice did. He was like a franchise owner. He didn't own the brand the church, but he was entitled to the profits from his specific location, the parish, as long as he followed the rules and performed his duties. This gave him a great deal of independence, but it also created a system that was ripe for problems. The benefice was valuable, and whenever something is valuable, people will find ways to exploit it. The story of the benefice is not just about how the church organized itself, it's also about the struggle for power and wealth that shaped medieval Europe for 1,000 years. The idea of the benefice didn't appear out of nowhere. Its roots run deep into the soil of the late Roman Empire and the Germanic kingdoms that replaced it. To understand the medieval benefice, you have to look back at how society was organized before the Middle Ages truly began. In the final centuries of the Roman Empire, the economy was in trouble. Small landowners were struggling. Many gave their land to a powerful local lord in exchange for protection. The lord would then grant the land back to the original owner for their use, often for their lifetime. This practice was called precarium. The person held the land by prayer or request. They didn't own it, but they could work it. This established a powerful precedent, the separation of ownership from use. A great landowner could use his property to support people and secure their loyalty without actually giving the land away forever. When the Germanic tribes, like the Franks, swept across the Roman province of Gaul, they brought their own customs. A Germanic war leader, or king, rewarded his best warriors with gifts. These gifts were often treasures, weapons, or horses. But the greatest gift of all was land. Land was wealth, it produced food and supported people. A king who gave his followers land ensured their loyalty. He could call on them to fight for him when he needed them. This grant was known in Latin as a beneficium, a favor. Charles Martel, the Frankish ruler in the early 8th century, faced a new military threat, fast-moving Arab cavalry raiding from Spain. To fight them, he needed his own heavy cavalry, knights with armor and war horses. Equipping and maintaining such a soldier was incredibly expensive. A warrior needed a lot of resources to support himself, his family, his servants, and his horses. The solution was land, but Charles Martel didn't have enough royal land to give away. So he looked at the church. The church in the Frankish kingdom had become immensely wealthy. Kings, nobles, and ordinary people had donated vast tracts of land to monasteries and bishoprics over the centuries, hoping to secure their salvation. Charles Martel and his successors, the Carolingian kings like Charlemagne, began a practice of seizing church lands and granting them as benefices to their warriors. They didn't technically take ownership. They forced the abbot or bishop to grant the land to the king's chosen man for his lifetime. In return, the warrior would pay a small rent to the church as a token to acknowledge the church's ultimate ownership. This was a turning point. It firmly linked the concept of the benefice to both military service and church property. It also blurred the lines between secular and spiritual authority. Kings and lords began to feel they had a right to control church appointments because they were using church resources to run their kingdoms. They started appointing their friends, relatives, and loyal soldiers as bishops and abbots. These men were often not very spiritual. They were administrators and warriors who now controlled vast church estates. The church itself started to use this system for its own internal organization. A bishop controlled all the church property in his diocese. To support the priests in the various towns and villages, he would grant them a parish as a benefice. The priest would get the income from the glebe land and the tithes, and in return he would perform the spiritual duties. It was a practical solution to a logistical problem. It decentralized the administration of church finances. The bishop didn't have to collect all the revenue and then pay out salaries. Each parish priest managed his own economic base. By the High Middle Ages, around the year 1000, the system was entrenched across Europe. Its society was a web of obligations. A knight held a fief from a lord in exchange for military service. A peasant held a strip of land from a knight in exchange for labor, and a priest held a benefice from a patron in exchange for spiritual service. The benefice had become the fundamental economic building block of the church. It determined who became a priest, where they lived, how they were paid, and to whom they were loyal. The old Roman and Germanic ideas had merged to create a uniquely medieval institution, one that would shape the lives of millions. So how did the system actually work on the ground? Getting a benefice was a formal process, at least in theory. It involved a patron, a candidate, and a bishop. The whole thing was a mix of property law, religious ceremony, and personal connections. The process began with the patron. The patron was the person or institution with the advosen, or the right to nominate a candidate for a vacant benefice. Who could be a patron? It varied widely. For a small village parish, the patron was often the local lord who had originally built or endowed the church on his manor. For a wealthier church in a town, the patron might be a monastery or a cathedral chapter. For the most powerful positions like a bishopric, the patron was usually the king or the pope. This right of patronage was valuable. It was a piece of property that could be inherited, sold, or given away. It gave the patron immense influence over the local community. When a benefice became vacant, usually because the previous incumbent had died, the patron would choose a successor. This was called presentation. The patron would formally present his chosen candidate to the bishop of the diocese. The candidate had to be a cleric, or at least be willing to be ordained. Next came the bishop's role. The bishop was supposed to examine the candidate to make sure he was suitable for the office. According to canon law, the candidate had to be of legitimate birth, old enough, usually 25 for a priest, and of good character. He was also supposed to have a basic education, enough to read Latin, conduct the services, and understand doctrine. If the bishop found the candidate suitable, he would accept the presentation. This was called institution. With institution, the bishop formally granted the candidate the cure of souls for that parish. He was now spiritually in charge, but he didn't have his money yet. The final step was induction. This was the physical part of the ceremony. A representative of the bishop, usually the archdeacon, would take the new priest to the parish church. He would place the priest's hand on the church door key or ring the church bell. This symbolized giving him physical possession of the church and all its properties, the building, the churchyard, the priest's house, and the glebe lands. From that moment on, the incumbent had the legal right to collect the income of the benefice. The income itself could vary enormously. A priest in a poor, remote, rural parish might have just a few acres of marshy glebe land and collect tithes from a handful of struggling peasants. His life would be one of poverty, not much different from his parishioners. On the other hand, the rector of a wealthy city parish could have a substantial income from tithes on trade, fees for lavish funerals, and rents from church-owned properties in town. And parish churches were just the bottom of the ladder. Higher up were positions like a canon in a cathedral. A canon's duty was to participate in the daily cycle of prayer at the cathedral. His benefice, called a prebend, was often a specific estate or church owned by the cathedral, whose revenues were set aside just for him. A bishopric, or an abbacy, was a massive benefice. A bishop was not only a spiritual leader, but also a great feudal lord. His benefice consisted of vast estates, dozens of manors, and even castles. The income from a major German or English bishopric could make a man as rich as the greatest nobles in the land. The duties were supposed to match the reward. A parish priest was the center of village life. Beyond his religious duties, he was often the most educated person around. He might be asked to witness contracts, write letters, or help settle local disputes. A bishop had huge responsibilities. He had to ordain priests, consecrate churches, administer justice in his own ecclesiastical courts, and manage the vast properties of his diocese. He was also often a key advisor to the king. In an ideal world, this system placed a qualified and dedicated man in every position, giving him the resources he needed to do his job for the good of the people. But the medieval world was far from ideal. The value of these benefices, from the smallest to the largest, made them targets for ambition, greed, and political maneuvering. The carefully constructed legal and religious process was often just a facade for a much messier reality. The benefice system was brilliant in theory. It provided a stable, decentralized way to fund the most extensive organization in Europe. But in practice, it was riddled with problems. The fact that a benefice was treated as a piece of property, a source of income, was its central flaw. It opened the door to a whole range of abuses that corrupted the church, from the parish level all the way to the papacy in Rome. One of the most widespread abuses was pluralism. This was the practice of holding more than one benefice at the same time. If one benefice provided a nice income, why not have 2 or 5 or 20? A well-connected cleric could accumulate benefices like a businessman collects properties. A royal official might be rewarded for his service to the king with the right to the income from several different parishes. He might also be a canon at 3 different cathedrals. A cardinal in Rome might be the bishop of a diocese in Germany, the abbot of a monastery in France, and the rector of a wealthy church in England, all at the same time. He would never visit any of these places. He was just collecting the revenues. Pluralism directly led to the second major abuse: absenteeism. A man can't be in 2 places at once, let alone 20. The pluralist had to be an absentee from most, if not all, of his benefices. The cure of souls. The fundamental duty attached to the benefice was completely ignored. A parish might go for decades without ever seeing its actual rector. So who did the work? The absentee incumbent would hire a substitute, a vicar, or a curate to perform the daily duties. He would pay the substitute a tiny fraction of the benefice's income, just enough to survive. This had a devastating effect on the quality of spiritual care. The absentee rector was often a highly educated man from a noble family. The man he hired to do the actual work was often a poorly educated priest, sometimes barely literate, who had no security and no prospects. He was the mass priest, who mumbled his way through the Latin services he barely understood. The parishioners were left with the dregs of the clerical profession, while a wealthy stranger collected the tithes they were forced to pay. The church building might fall into disrepair, and the priest's house might be a hovel because the absentee rector wasn't interested in spending any of his income on maintenance. Then there was simony, the buying and selling of church offices. This was officially a terrible sin, named after Simon Magus in the Bible, who tried to buy the power of the Holy Spirit. But it was rampant. A benefice was an investment. A person might pay a patron a large sum of money to be presented to a lucrative benefice, knowing he would make his money back, and more from the income over his lifetime. Ambitious men bought their way up the ecclesiastical ladder, purchasing ever richer benefices. This meant that positions often went not to the most pious or lollified, but to the richest or the best connected. Closely related was nepotism. Powerful churchmen, who were supposed to be celibate, often looked after their families. A bishop would ensure that his nephews, sometimes his own unacknowledged sons, were well taken care of. He would use his power as a patron to grant them the best benefices in his diocese. The popes of the Renaissance were masters of this, making their young nephews cardinals and granting them a portfolio of benefices that made them fabulously wealthy. These abuses were not secret. Everyone knew they were happening. For centuries, sincere reformers within the church tried to fight against them. Great reform movements, like the Gregorian Reform in the 11th century, fought to end lay control and simony. And church councils passed laws against pluralism and absenteeism again and again, but the system was too entrenched. Kings and nobles refused to give up their rights of patronage, which were a source of power and a way to reward their followers. The papacy itself was too involved in the system of benefices, using them as a source of revenue and a tool of international diplomacy. By the late Middle Ages, the situation had become a scandal. The common person saw a church that seemed more interested in money and property than in saving souls. They saw their parish tithes being sent off to a rich man in a distant city. They saw priests who were ignorant and immoral. This widespread resentment and disillusionment created fertile ground for critics of the church. When figures like John Wycliffe in England, Jan Hus in Bohemia, and later Martin Luther in Germany began to preach, they found a ready audience. The corruption of the Benefice system was one of their main targets. For them, it was the most visible proof that the church had lost its spiritual mission. The call for reformation was, in many ways, a direct response to the failures of the Benefice system. The medieval Benefice system, which had defined the church's structure for a millennium, did not end overnight. It slowly crumbled away over several centuries, battered by religious reformation, political revolution, and the rise of the modern state. Its decline was a long and complicated process, but it was inevitable. The world was changing, and the Benefice no longer fit. Came with the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Martin Luther and other reformers attacked the very idea of the church as a great property-owning institution. They argued that the wealth and corruption of the church, embodied by the Benefice system, were a betrayal of the gospel. In the lands that became Protestant, the old system was dismantled. In England, Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries and seized their vast lands, which had provided thousands of benefices. Church property was taken over by the crown and sold off to the gentry. In Germany and Scandinavia, rulers secularized church lands, taking them for the state. The idea of the cure of souls remained, but the economic structure changed. Clergy in Protestant countries began to be paid in a way that looks more familiar to us, often with a stipend or salary paid by the state or a local parish board. The direct link between a specific piece of land and a specific spiritual office was broken. The Catholic Church was not immune to these calls for change. The Council of Trent, the Church's great response to the Protestant challenge in the mid-16th century, took the abuses of the Benefice system head-on. The council passed strict decrees against pluralism and absenteeism. Bishops were ordered to reside in their dioceses. Every cleric with a cure of souls was ordered to live in his parish. Simony was condemned in the strongest terms. The council also ordered the creation of seminaries in every diocese to ensure that priests were properly educated and trained, tackling the problem of the ignorant curate. These reforms had a real impact. The worst of the old abuses were gradually cleaned up in Catholic countries. But the fundamental structure of the Benefice remained. It was too deeply woven into the fabric of society and law to be removed entirely. The next great shock was the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. The revolutionaries saw the church, with its immense landholdings and its system of tithes, as a pillar of the old unjust regime. In 1789, the new revolutionary government confiscated all church property in France. All of it. The lands, the buildings, everything. Benefices were simply abolished. Priests and bishops were to become paid employees of the state, required to swear an oath of loyalty to the new government. This was a radical break with the past. Napoleon Bonaparte later spread these ideas across Europe as his armies marched across the continent. In many parts of Germany, Italy, and Spain, church lands were secularized. The old world, where a bishop was also a feudal prince ruling over his own territory, was gone forever. Even in countries that avoided revolution, like Britain, the 19th century brought major reforms. A series of parliamentary acts addressed the inequalities and inefficiencies of the old system. The ecclesiastical commissioners were established to manage the wealth of the Church of England, pooling income from richer benefices to supplement the poorer ones. Pluralism was further restricted, and the process for removing neglectful clergy was made easier. The system was slowly being rationalized and modernized. Today, the medieval Benefice is essentially gone. Sure, the term might still exist in some corners of the Church of England as a legal fossil, but the reality behind it has vanished. Clergy are now paid salaries. The tithe has been replaced by voluntary giving and modern taxation. The church is funded and administered in ways that would be recognizable to any modern nonprofit organization. Yet, the legacy of the Benefice is all around us. The very layout of Europe's towns and villages was shaped by it. The old parish church, the rectory next door, and the fields that were once the glebe are physical remnants of this ancient system. The idea of a parish as a defined geographical area with its own church and its own pastor is a direct inheritance from the benefice system. The vast wealth and cultural influence of the church in European history was built on the foundation of this institution. The benefice was a practical solution to the problem of supporting a continent-wide organization in a pre-modern agrarian economy. It worked, for a time, but its inherent flaw, the treatment of the spiritual office as a piece of property, eventually led to corruption that undermined the very mission it was meant to serve. Its long, slow death was a key part of the transition from the medieval world to the modern one.